a psychedelic storm coming. I believe that it's no longer possible to kind of hold back the floodgates of our curiosity into these peculiar substances. I feel like everybody these days is curious about psychedelics and what these drugs do and how they actually affect the mind, which is a very natural curiosity to have. I mean, humans have been altering their minds for as long as we've been humans. So I think at this point, it's kind of pointless to hold back the inevitable revolution that's on the way with psychedelics. Now, since I am talking about kind of controversial subject matter, YouTube will probably suppress this video a little bit. So I really appreciate it if you guys liked and commented on this one to kind of help it get more traction. But like I said, psychedelics are becoming mainstream, and I think for good reason, because psychedelics essentially give people a window into their own unconscious functionings. But I think more fundamentally, and I think more attractively for people, psychedelics allow you to experience what it's like to have a completely different mentality. I would almost like describe it as a different mindscape. Almost like as a different plane of existence. When you have your mind altered like that, it really is like walking in some parallel dimension. Honestly, that's the best way to describe it. I'll leave a link up here or here, wherever it'll pop up, probably here, I think. Where you can watch a video where I describe what it feels like to take psychedelics, and I try to use the language to kind of encapsulate the experience, which is a very difficult thing to do, but also a very insufficient thing to do, because honestly, the only thing that's really going to capture what it's like to take psychedelics is to take psychedelics yourself. I'm not necessarily encouraging you to do that. In fact, I'm very big on harm reduction, so I don't actually encourage people to take psychedelics at all. But like I said, it's almost like the fact that humans will take psychedelics is inevitable. But if you're interested in what psychedelics do to the mind and how they affect the mind, but you don't actually want to take them, that video might kind of give you a sense of the way the mind is affected when you take psychedelic substances. But like I said, I believe it's no longer possible to kind of hold back the floodgates. More and more people are taking these drugs, and I do see a very positive, potentially positive impact that these drugs can have on mental health. Again, if used correctly. They do seem to facilitate the process of kind of diving into one's own unconscious mind. Something in psychotherapy, which takes a lot of training and practice, can be done relatively seamlessly with psychedelics. And they allow for a deepening of somebody's perspective, which is a very valuable tool in psychotherapy, because a lot of psychotherapy entails trying to get somebody to kind of adopt a new perspective and look at their situation in a new light. So psychedelics, I believe, will probably end up becoming very useful tools in the treatment of mental health problems. Although there are definitely risks involved, and that should go without saying, just like there, are risks with any drug. Anything this powerful ought to come with a warning label. If psychedelics weren't so profound, they probably wouldn't be that dangerous. They are dangerous precisely because they are so profound and so mind-altering, and aka not a joke. But in this video, I wanted to explain one particular effect of psychedelics, and that is their capacity to expand consciousness. Now, I know that sounds like very hippie and mystical, like, oh man, they expand consciousness, bro. But I mean this in a very literal sense, that they expand the scope of the conscious mind. That's actually a good metaphor for it. You can think of your consciousness as a kind of like telescope or something, which allows you to pinpoint and explicitly know something. Now, the scope of that ability to explicitly know something is greatly expanded under the influence of psychedelics. But yeah, in this video, I wanted to kind of go into a very nerdy intellectual dive about how I believe that actually works. This is not the only effect that psychedelics have. There are a lot of effects, and there are a lot of like dose-dependent effects as well. But this is an effect which I've commonly observed in people and in my research, where it feels as though the mind has access to more thought pathways. And so you can think about things in a much more complicated and multifaceted manner. Now, there are different types of psychedelics, and obviously different drugs have different effects. But what I'm talking about does apply to like some of the more common psychedelics like LSD, psilocybin, and the like. Now, to explain how psychedelics expand consciousness, we need to ask ourselves what consciousness actually is. Luckily, I've made a couple of videos about this. I'll put a link here, which discusses how consciousness arises from language. Obviously, there's a sense in which it can't fully explain consciousness. It can't explain like the kind of qualia aspect of consciousness, but it can explain how our minds are able to understand things. Like, how do you understand these words, for instance? It explains that. So watching that video will definitely make what I'm about to say less alienating and strange. But ultimately, the feeling of consciousness arises from a feeling of familiarity we have with a thing. Essentially, anytime we are conscious of something, we are imposing an internal concept that we've stored up upon it. And the feeling of familiarity between that internal concept and that thing is the sense of consciousness. It produces this sense of familiarity. This Jung quote above me explains it quite well, because he's saying that cognition is akin to recognition. I.e., what this means is that whenever we're conscious of something, what we are really experiencing is a sense of familiarity which that object has to something which we already know. When you're conscious of your feet, for example, the word feet draws your attention to the actual object, your feet. And so the word itself kind of encapsulates your mental understanding of it. And so to be conscious of your feet is essentially to apply this internal mental concept to the actual space in which your feet are. Julian James was actually described this as creating a mind space in actual space. So you create a mind space where your feet are, and then filling this mind space with your internal concept of feet. Now, I know that might sound a little jarring to some of you. And so instead you can try and be conscious of a concept. For example, the concept of peace. How is it that your mind can understand the word peace and know what it means? It's because the word itself is kind of like this key which activates a net of connotations inside your mind which you associate with the concept of peace and which constitutes your understanding of the word. Every word and every concept is ultimately connected to various associations which we each individually have and which we each individually develop for the meanings of those words. We each understand words slightly differently, but we understand the word because it's essentially connected to things which we associate with the concept. So when you think about peace, you may think about, I don't know, people holding hands or something, or like a specific peace agreement that you may be familiar with. It's based on your own personal experiences, but your own personal experiences and the connotations which are associated with the concept, they become activated implicitly whenever I say the word peace. And this connection between those implicit internal concepts and the word is the sense of familiarity we have for the idea of peace. It's why it's not like an alien concept, it's a familiar concept. And that sense of familiarity comes from the way your mind kind of activates a broad set of connotations associated with the idea. If I pick a place, for instance, like Africa, the word itself is able to access all of the unconscious ideas you associate with the idea of Africa. And implicitly, that's what the feeling of familiarity is to the idea of Africa. And so in your mind, you might be imagining a map or like people from Africa or, anything you might associate with the idea of Africa. And interestingly, you can actually, even though most of these things remain in the unconscious and are implicitly associated with the idea of Africa, you can bring them up to consciousness. So you can bring up those associations. So if you're unconsciously thinking about the people from Africa, you can bring that up to consciousness. And the fact that I'm mentioning the unconscious here is actually very important because we like to make a hard division between consciousness and the unconscious, like they're separate regions of the mind. But in reality, consciousness arises out of the unconscious. It sits on the unconscious. It sits on this unconscious net of associations that I discussed. Consciousness is ultimately a product of various unconscious processes. I can actually demonstrate this fact quite easily. So I'll put a nice and relevant quote up on the screen. I don't know what it'll be. I think I'll make it like something from Nietzsche. Yeah, that'll be good. Now, as you read this quote one word at a time, each time you read an individual word, it's like you're momentarily conscious of it. And then as you read the next word, you kind of put the previous word back into the unconscious, i.e. you're no longer conscious of it. So as your mind moves from word to word, you're momentarily conscious of each word, but then a moment later, whatever you read before goes into the unconscious. So how is it possible to understand the meaning of the entire quote? Well, it's because each word activates a set of associations in the unconscious, right? And then the next word activates a set of related connotations based on the context. And this is how you can make sense of the entire paragraph. Everything in your mind that's relevant to the paragraph becomes activated, and this is how you get this sense that you understand the entire thing. Another important thing to realize is that this process operates through metaphors. Metaphors are ultimately what makes understanding something possible. Let's take, for instance, the word combating in this sentence. When I say the word combat, you probably imagine something related to fighting. But in this sentence, even though it isn't talking about literally fighting, you still actually think about the kind of connotations you associate with fighting. So fighting and combat is being used as a metaphor in this sentence, but you're applying it in a different sense, not in a literal physical sense, but in rather this kind of mental struggle which Nietzsche is describing. And so combat is used as a metaphor here to kind of make what Nietzsche is saying more clear, to kind of produce a sense of understanding, because you understand what combat is, and so you can kind of understand what Nietzsche is saying even though he's not referring to literal combat. And so these connotations are helping you to understand what Nietzsche is trying to get across. I mean, even that right there, get across, that itself is a metaphor of like connecting a bridge. And again, that metaphor itself and the connotations it activates helps you understand what I'm saying. Once you notice it, you notice that like all of your language is metaphorical, and different metaphors that you use produce different kinds of understanding. But if I go back to the example of combating, notice also that the literal connotation, the actual, physical fist fight, is kind of blocked out. Our minds suppress connotations which aren't actually relevant to the situation. And so that's why you can understand the entire paragraph, because things which, activations and connotations which are associated with each word but are not relevant to what this sentence is actually saying, they kind of get suppressed, whereas connotations that are relevant become activated. And so our minds don't just activate connotations, they suppress unrelated connotations. This is easily demonstrable. For example, think about the word bark. Did I mean tree bark? Or did I mean bark as in dogs barking? When you understand the word one way, you necessarily block out the connotations associated with the other way, and vice versa. So what I'm claiming occurs when you take psychedelics is that this process of your mind kind of building a net of connotations based on activation, so based on words, or based on concepts that you know, this net of potential connections is greatly expanded. This is a good illustration showing how the brain works. Whenever you think about anything, neurons that are associated with that thought become activated. And so, like, for example, if I say the word luck, you may automatically and unconsciously think about something like, I don't know, four-leaf clovers. So when you take psychedelics, essentially the number of possible connections increases greatly. So the number of possible associations that you associate with the word luck, it seems to increase immensely. For example, the word tree just means tree, right? It's nothing remarkable. There's nothing, it seems that when you think about the word tree, it's a very basic kind of one-to-one connotation match between the internal concept and the idea of a tree. But when you take psychedelics, the number of possible connotations you can associate with that concept, it's vastly expanded. And so all of these connotations become activated. And so when you think about the concept of a tree, it's in this much more rich and complicated manner. Before it was just kind of this single mundane object, but now a million other possible connotations which you associate with the concept of trees are now potentially activated and rising up and kind of informing how you think about that subject. And so you might be thinking about, for example, like all the different kinds of trees, or about plants in general, or like the texture of trees, the way trees feel, the way it feels to climb them, the way they smell, and the way they grow slowly, and the fact that massive trees must be extremely old and even possibly spanning multiple generations of people. You can even think about things like the fact that the tree's leaves are responsible for drawing up water from the ground, sometimes like a gravity-defying distance, or the way they can turn carbon in the air into solid carbon in their, bark and leaves and branches. So many possible things can become activated when you think about the concept of a tree. But usually in normal states of mind, there's a kind of limitation in how many connotations there are. But when you take psychedelics, it seems like that net is much more diverse and much more fluid. And so a huge number of possible connotations can now be used to inform how you perceive the object. And so that's why something as seemingly mundane as a tree becomes like this exceptionally mind-blowing and complicated idea. In fact, we can use the metaphor of a tree to elucidate what I'm talking about here. You can think of the tree as the thing we're conscious of, and its roots as being all the connotations it's connected to. Well, when you take psychedelics, it's almost like this root system just expands crazily. It's almost like you have access to more of your mind and more of the things which you can potentially associate with any concept. And so any concept you think about suddenly becomes much more complicated and much richer rather than being relatively simple. So this allows for the mind to think in a much more flexible and complicated manner. Because all of these connotations in your unconscious can act as metaphors to help elucidate the thing that we're conscious of. And so everything you perceive has this air of like overwhelming significance. And that's why people in psychedelic trances, it's almost like they're just amazed by the sheer wonder of existence because they're using their entire minds when they're perceiving the world. And so everything seems to be super complicated and incredibly much more, grand than what it seems like when we're in ordinary states of consciousness. It's almost like you're using more of your mind to think about anything. And so whatever it is, if it's a complicated topic, it becomes easier to grasp. Take, for instance, like lengths of time. It's hard to imagine the time scales of the earth, like how long ago dinosaurs died, or even like events in history. But when your mind is able to kind of activate more concepts, it feels like something like that is much more graspable. It doesn't feel abstract. It feels like because you're using more of your brain, something like that is within grasp. It's no longer this incomprehensible idea. But this isn't all that happens. It seems like the mind is able to think in a much more flexible manner. It seems that suppression mechanism, which I discussed before, is less activated. And so if you were to try this, imagine, for example, closing your eyes and imagine something very specific. For instance, imagine an eagle carrying a snake. When you imagine that image probably isn't super detailed. Obviously, it depends from person to person, but it's probably not like hyper realistic or anything. And so it might be hard to kind of hold on to that image. Well, when you take psychedelics, many people report a stronger ability to visualize things. And they're able to add more details to their visualizations. And it seems that this is because, again, more neurons are being activated in order to generate that image. And so you can generate a very sophisticated image with a lot of detail. And so when you imagine something like that, you can see it in a lot richer detail and it looks more vivid and you can hold on to it for a longer time. Another thing that's really cool is that these unconscious contents, because they're being activated, they have the chance to rise up to consciousness. And there's an insane amount of material which exists in the unconscious psyche. And psychedelics seem to give us access to all of it. Or maybe not all of it, but a lot of it, more of it, let's say. Not just these unconscious connotations that I've been discussing, even though that makes up a large proportion of the unconscious, but also things like memories that you've forgotten about. They seem much more easily retrievable. And when I say the unconscious is enormous, I really mean it. This also includes all of the things which you do unconsciously. And when I say the unconscious is enormous, I really mean it. Because this also includes all of the things which you do unconsciously, which you don't notice that you do. For instance, do you ever unconsciously just reach for your phone? Your muscle memory is also largely unconscious. We do a lot without thinking about it. But when we take psychedelics, it's like all of these things which we were previously unconscious of, they no longer get filtered out and our minds become drawn to them. So even something like walking, just normally walking, most people just walk relatively unconsciously. You don't think about it, but when you take psychedelics, you begin to notice the way you walk and you begin to notice like the specific details of the way you walk. And you're like, wait, did I really walk like this? So we can think of consciousness as a device which scans the unconscious. Psychedelics basically enhance this device and make it much more powerful. And so a lot of things which are ordinarily not picked up by the conscious mind, or which the conscious mind has difficulty kind of detecting, it seems that they're able to reach the conscious mind because of the way psychedelics are able to activate broad nets of connotations. This also helps to explain the kind of boosted creativity which psychedelics enable, which has been hopefully made clear by all of these cool paintings which I'm showing you. But like you notice like the trippy otherworldly nature of these images, it also speaks to the kind of fluidity that the mind has in psychedelic states of mind. Because again, more ideas are informing the way you think about things, and so you don't use your ordinary thought patterns. Instead, you begin to think beyond the boundaries which normally constitute your cognition. Cognition is itself a kind of narrowing of the mind. This is what allows our minds to focus and make things explicit. But this narrowing is also a kind of restriction. Psychedelics open the valve, so to speak, so that our thinking is broadened and that our minds can contemplate things which we ordinarily don't think about, because again, so many unconscious contents are just rising up. And so all of these thoughts are potentially going to be within the scope of the conscious mind. Now, an important thing to note about this is that this is not always a welcome event. For instance, whenever the shadow is becoming revealed through psychedelics, people very often resist that because, again, people naturally don't want to look at their shadows. That's kind of why it's a shadow, because we reject those contents. But again, the unconscious is almost insistent on making itself known, which can be a very scary experience. And so, again, this is one of the dangers of psychedelics and something that people should be aware about before they, take these substances, because it is a risk. But with that said, I do think that these can potentially be very useful tools, especially for helping people in order to consider things more deeply and understand the world in a much more complex manner. The conscious mind has a very strong tendency to simplify things. Our conscious minds prefer simplifications, and not only that, they prefer to confirm things that we already know. They're very confirmation bias heavy. Because again, it craves that sense of familiarity. And that sense of familiarity is very strongly associated with kind of confirming the things that we know, because we have these internal models, and then we feel this click whenever those internal models are kind of, justified or confirmed. But oftentimes what we really need is the ability to deeply contemplate things, using the full power of our minds. For instance, something like this planet, that's like too complex to actually think about, and so we just kind of simplify it. And you can imagine a million ways in which this planet is like the most complicated object in existence. Obviously, the universe itself is more complicated, but still, it's a very complicated object, and it's hard for our minds to wrap itself around the true complexity of something like the Earth. But when you take psychedelics, your mind is able to access much more ideas, and these ideas inform your consciousness of the concept. And so you can truly begin to grapple with the sheer complexity of something like that. And again, this is why psychedelics produce this feeling of amazement and wonderment for existence. Because you begin to truly understand how mind-boggling things are when you're able to think more complexly about it all. Including things like the mind itself. So like the mind, just the fact that you have a mind, it'll blow your mind when you take psychedelics. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed the discussion. I hope that it was clear. If you're interested in becoming a member of our community, you can sign up at Patreon and join our Discord server. And it will help run this channel because I make like very, very little off ad revenue. So any support from you guys would be really, really appreciated. It's very cheap and you'll get a lot of benefits, including the ability to have discussions with me and, message me directly. But yeah, thanks for watching. Have a good day, and may good luck always come your way.